The auctioneer couldn't stop smiling. $500? He asked. The crowd laughed. The tractor looked terrible. Rust covered the hood. One rear tire was flat. The paint had disappeared decades ago. Even the dealer who brought it there shook his head. "That thing's headed for scrap," somebody muttered. A few people nodded. One mechanic looked at the engine and said it wouldn't last another season. The old farmer handed over 5 $100 bills anyway. Didn't argue. Didn't negotiate. Just climbed into the seat and hauled the tractor home. 40 years later, every machine that laughed at it was gone, and that rusted old tractor was still working the same fields. The strange part wasn't that he bought it. The strange part was that he knew something everyone else missed. The farmer's name was Walter Briggs. In 1984, he owned a small operation in eastern Iowa. Nothing fancy, a few hundred acres, an aging barn, and equipment that was wearing out faster than he could afford to replace it. That spring, one of his tractors finally gave up. The transmission failed during planting season. The repair estimate was nearly $4,000. Walter didn't have $4,000. What he had was $500. So he started looking at auctions. Most of the machines in his price range weren't much better than scrap. Then he saw the tractor, a 1958 model sitting in the back corner of a dusty auction yard. The hood was rusted. The paint was gone. One fender hung loose. Grass had grown around the tires. Nobody wanted it. The dealer who consigned it admitted it hadn't run properly in years. Most buyers didn't even stop to inspect it. They walked past without slowing down. Walter didn't. He spent nearly an hour around that tractor, checking bolts, looking underneath, turning the crank by hand, listening, watching. The crowd thought he was crazy. The auctioneer joked that the tractor was worth more as lawn decoration. Even a local mechanic told him he was throwing money away. But Walter kept looking, because while everyone else saw rust, he was paying attention to something deeper. And what he found would keep that old tractor working long after newer machines had disappeared from the fields entirely. Walter wasn't looking at the paint. He wasn't looking at the rust. And he definitely wasn't looking at the torn seat everyone kept laughing about. He was looking at the engine block. Back then, manufacturers built tractors differently. Thick cast iron, simple fuel systems. Mechanical parts that could be repaired with basic tools instead of expensive electronics. Walter knew that because he'd spent half his life fixing machinery. The rust didn't bother him. Rust was cosmetic. What mattered was whether the heart of the machine was still sound. And when he turned the crank by hand that day at the auction, he felt something. Compression, not perfect, but enough. Enough to tell him the engine wasn't dead, just neglected, so he hauled it home. The first month wasn't glamorous. He spent evenings in the barn after dinner, pulling apart fuel lines, cleaning decades of dirt from the carburetor, replacing hoses, finding parts from salvage yards. Some pieces cost only a few dollars. Others took months to locate. But little by little, the old tractor started coming back to life. First time the engine fired, the sound startled half the barn swallows nesting in the rafters. A deep diesel rumble, rough at first, then steady. Walter just sat there listening, smiling, not because the tractor was fixed, because it had proven him right. The neighbors weren't convinced. They called it a hobby project, a temporary machine, something to use until he could afford a real tractor. Walter never argued. He simply put it to work. Spring planting, summer mowing, fall harvest, year after year. And something interesting started happening. The old tractor never seemed to ask for much. Oil, filters, basic maintenance. That was about it. Meanwhile, the newer tractors around the county became increasingly complicated. Computer systems, electronic sensors, hydraulic controls, comfortable cabs, more power, more features, and far more things that could break. At first, nobody cared. Modern equipment was faster, bigger, more impressive, but every harvest season seemed to bring another expensive repair bill. $10,000 here, $15,000 there. A failed control module, a damaged hydraulic system, an electrical problem nobody could diagnose without a dealership computer. Walter's tractor didn't know what a computer was. It didn't have sensors, it didn't have software updates, it didn't even have a radio. What it had was simplicity, and simplicity kept showing up every morning ready to work. The years rolled by. 5, 10, 15, then 20. Farmers who once laughed at the tractor started noticing something strange. Their second tractor was replacing their first. Then their third replaced their second. Some had financed 3 or 4 different machines during the same period. Walter was still using the same rusted tractor he bought for $500. The paint looked worse now. The seat had been replaced twice. The headlights worked only when they felt like it, but the engine still started. And every year, the old machine kept teaching the same lesson. People often mistake new for better, and those are not always the same thing. The real surprise came around year 25, not because the tractor broke, because everyone else's did. That was when manufacturers started changing how farm equipment was built. More electronics, more computers, more proprietary systems. Repairs that once took an afternoon now require dealership technicians. Diagnostic software, specialized tools, parts that couldn't be bought locally. At first, farmers accepted it. That was progress, or at least that's what they were told. Then a drought year hit. Margins tightened. Repair costs started mattering more. One farmer paid $12,000 for a transmission repair. Another waited 6 weeks for an electronic module stuck in a supply chain delay. A third had a tractor sit idle for almost 2 months because a sensor smaller than a deck of cards had failed. Walter watched all of it, then climbed into his old tractor and went back to work. The machine didn't know there was a supply chain problem. It didn't care. It had no electronics to fail, no computer to lock up, no software updates, no dealer authorization codes, just steel, fuel, compression, and 40 years of proven reliability. Then something happened nobody expected. The manufacturer that originally built Walter's tractor disappeared, merged, sold, renamed, eventually gone altogether. The newer machines became obsolete almost overnight. Parts became harder to find. Support vanished. Owners discovered that modern equipment ages faster than anyone likes to admit. But Walter had spent decades collecting spare parts. Not intentionally, just because he never threw useful things away. An extra fuel pump here, a starter motor there, boxes of old components stacked on shelves in the barn. Suddenly people started visiting him, not to laugh, to ask for help. Farmers who once joked about his rusted tractor now drove across counties looking for parts, looking for advice, looking for anything that could keep their own equipment running. One afternoon, a young farmer showed up with a broken electronic tractor worth nearly $300,000. It had been sitting dead in a field for 3 weeks. Walter listened, nodded, then pointed toward the old 1958 tractor parked beside the shed. The machine started on the first turn. Same rumble, same smoke, same steady idle. The young farmer just stared, then looked back at his own silent tractor. And for the first time in decades, Walter heard somebody say the exact opposite of what he'd heard at the auction. I should have bought one like that. Because the thing everyone had missed for 40 years wasn't hidden inside the tractor. It was hidden inside the idea of it. The old machine wasn't valuable because it was old. It was valuable because it was built to be repaired instead of replaced. By the 40th year, the tractor had become something more than equipment. People knew it by name, not the model number, not the manufacturer. Just Walter's tractor. Visitors stopped to take pictures of it. Young farmers asked about it. Agricultural magazines even ran a story after hearing rumors about a machine that had worked continuously since the 1950s. Most of them expected to find a museum piece, something polished and protected. Instead, they found a tractor still hauling wagons, still mowing fields, still earning its keep. The paint was almost completely gone now. The hood carried dents from decades of work. The steering wheel had been repaired more times than anyone could remember. But the engine still sounded exactly the same. Deep, steady, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. Then came the county fair. That was where the story finally came full circle. The fair organizers invited Walter to display the tractor as part of an agricultural heritage exhibit. Modern equipment manufacturers sponsored booths nearby. Machines worth $500,000, GPS systems, touchscreen controls, autonomous driving technology. Everything farming had become, and parked among all of it, sat the rusted tractor that everyone once laughed at. The crowd around it never seemed to leave. Older farmers brought grandchildren over to see it. Mechanics pointed at the engine design. People stood there telling stories, because almost everyone in the county remembered the auction. They remembered the jokes, the laughter, the predictions that the tractor wouldn't survive a season. Now 40 years had passed, and the tractor was still there. Many of the machines that mocked it were gone, scrapped, sold, forgotten. But the $500 tractor remained. Late that afternoon, one of the men who'd laughed the loudest at the auction walked over. His hair was gray now, his back slightly bent. He stood beside the tractor for a long moment before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought you were crazy." Walter smiled. "I know." The man ran his hand along the faded hood, then laughed softly. "Turns out I was the crazy one." Walter looked across the fairgrounds, at the crowds, at the young farmers taking pictures, at the machine that had spent 4 decades proving a point nobody wanted to hear. Then he said something simple, something he'd learned long ago. The best things aren't always the newest. And standing there beside that old tractor, nobody argued with him anymore. A few years later, Walter's tractor was still working. Not every day anymore. The heavier jobs had gone to newer equipment. Time catches up with everything eventually, even machines. But every spring, Walter still climbed into the old seat, still turned the key, still listened for that familiar rumble. And every spring, the engine answered. The tractor had become part of the farm, part of the landscape, like the barn, like the windmill, like the fence posts his father set decades earlier. People who visited often asked why he kept it. Why not restore it completely? Why not park it somewhere and preserve it? Walter always gave the same answer, because that wasn't what it was built for. The tractor didn't need to be admired, it needed to work. That was the lesson. Not just about machinery, about life. The world spends a lot of time chasing whatever is newer, bigger, faster, more expensive, and sometimes that's the right choice, but not always. Sometimes the things that last are the things nobody notices at first, the things people overlook because they're scratched, worn out, a little rusty around the edges. The tractor never became famous outside the county. It never ended up in a museum. It never sold for a fortune. It simply kept doing what it had always done, showing up, doing the work, and lasting far longer than anyone thought possible. When Walter passed away, his grandson inherited the farm, along with the tractor. The first thing he did that spring was drive it into the field, just like Walter had, just like Walter's father had taught him. The engine started, the same sound, the same steady rhythm. And as the old tractor rolled across another season of Iowa soil, it carried one final reminder. Never confuse age with weakness, and never mistake rust for the end of the story.